There is no doubt that the COVID-19 pandemic is going to wreak havoc politically, economically, and socially on the continent of Africa. The pandemic came at a time in which Africa was honestly starting to see a renaissance. It also came at a time when the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative was starting to place Africa into a Chinese sphere of influence, influenced by debt and infrastructure. Now, South Africa is accepting unprecedented loans from the IMF, and there are growing issues with Chinese projects in the region. We're going to cover all of this today on the Tonic Accord podcast. Hey, everybody, and welcome back to the Tonic Accord podcast. Alex Kapitko here, joined with Drew Nepley. Drew, how's the day going? Feeling good?
I'm feeling good, man. We got the live stream going. I'm hydrated. It's close to triple digits here in Southern California, but thankfully I have air conditioning thanks to the 21st century, and yeah, I'm feeling good.
Yeah, man, it's that time of summer. Honestly, it's weird up here in Northern California because where I'm at, usually we don't get into the 90s, and we've been getting into the 90s this year. So I don't love it. It's been a lot of red flag fire dangers and stuff like that. So not great. I'm kind of honestly ready for October and November rain, but what do you do? I saw you guys have a fire down there too.
Do we really? I didn't even know that. Oh gosh. I mean, that's what happens. We get into triple digits with some wind. We've had the hot wind. All it takes is one guy throwing a cigarette butt out of his car window, and that's what happens. It's every year here in Southern California. It's fires.
Yeah, definitely. So today, I mean, I think we have kind of a lot to cover. I wanted to kind of, if it's okay with you, kind of just turn this into a look at kind of where Africa's at and maybe what they can do, especially in terms of, the Belt and Road Initiative, which we have definitely talked about before.
Yeah.
And I guess to kind of start off this conversation, I do want to mention the article that you have on the screen, which is about South Africa borrowing from the IMF for the first time since apartheid. And what is interesting to me about it is that a lot of African countries are really hesitant about the IMF, right? Because in the late 1970s, we kind of saw this surgence of neoliberalism throughout the world. And this was kind of the insistence by the West, mainly, of privatization of resources, high debt, high loan markets. And kind of over time, this kind of failed a lot of these countries who really couldn't keep up with these massive debts they were inheriting for infrastructure projects. And so they called this, I think they called it structural adjustment, which referred to the purpose of correcting trade imbalances and government deficits. And it involved cutting back the role of the state and promoting the role of the private sector, like I said. And this was kind of the neoliberalism, free market fundamentalism. But or the Washington consensus, I guess you could also call it. And
Right.
in all honesty, it kind of screwed over a lot of these poor countries, not even in Africa, but in Southeast Asia, Latin America, the Caribbean, just countries that really didn't have the economies or the resources to really basically follow a Western model that worked well for countries like the United States, but who knows if they're going to work well for, say, Zimbabwe. And so that's kind of what happened was after the apartheid regime fell and Nelson Mandela became president, he actually was willing to start working with the IMF and the World Bank because he knew it would probably be necessary just because it's hard to play in the world if you're not part of the system that's winning. And so I think he understood that. But the African National Congress, which is South Africa's like governing body or congressional body, you could say, they always rejected it. And it was kind of this pro-African, pan-African movement that said we don't need these external factors. And so to me, this huge stimulus now that has kind of come out of this is sort of wild to me because basically, let's see, I have the numbers here. It was a $4.3 billion emergency loan from the IMF. And what to me it shows is that Africa is starting to struggle again. And the coronavirus has probably helped with that because also South Africa has one of the worst parts of the pandemic in all of Africa. But also their president, or their previous president, Jacob Zuma, he pretty much put the country into horrible public debt because I have the numbers here. In between 96 and 2009 under Tito Mboweni, who was the governor of the Reserve Bank in South Africa, the country was doing actually quite well on their own. And so I think that's why this is alarming because Africa's really been struggling. Like the ratio in South Africa of public debt to GDP rose from 26% in 2008 to 56%.
Yeah.
So twice.
That's huge.
And so to me, it's saying, okay, if South Africa is going to start now asking for relief, is this marking kind of what's going to happen around Africa? And it's sad to me because this is a continent that actually was seeing some Pan-African movements and kind of a resurgent. They have a young millennial population who are progressive and want change. And I'm worried that the pandemic plus I bet you're going to get into the Chinese side of this, but there's a lot of issues. So sorry, long background, but yeah, what are your thoughts on everything happening here?
Um, I mean, I think it's like the pendulum swinging, right? You mentioned that history of that neoliberal experiment with a lot of developing nations, and sometimes it helped, and sometimes a lot of times it didn't in the long run. You had a pendulum swing back to like the pink tide in Latin America, where it was no, we don't want foreign investment, we want domestic spending and import subsidized economies. But that also kind of failed. I mean, look at where Venezuela's gotten to today. It's probably one of the worst examples. But other countries like Nicaragua, um, Cuba have kind of maintained this pink tide, and they're not doing so hot on the global scale. I wonder if this is the pendulum swinging back again towards, okay, like you mentioned, like Nelson Mandela's idea of, well, we kind of do have to play the game if this is the game that's being played on the world scale. I mean, if you don't play the game at all, you're not going to win. And so I wonder if this is the swing back to that welcoming of foreign investment, trying to, cut public spending in certain ways and promote private investment, privatization of industries, which we'll talk a little bit about in Ethiopia in a bit as well. But yeah, I mean, it is a big telltale sign that if they're willing to borrow again from the IMF, that the tides are changing, that maybe the bad taste that people had in their mouths back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Maybe with a new generation and a new modern world, right, more tech-based, more globalized, perhaps, the need for foreign investment, there is a need for foreign investment, and I think people are realizing that. But you have to be careful about, who it is, what kind of foreign investment are you taking, and at what kind of cost. What are the rules about this? South Africa borrowing from the IMF, I think that's preferable in a way or two to countries like Ethiopia that are doing deals with China and infrastructure deals. A lot of countries in Africa are doing deals with China, and they come at a serious cost. One aspect is, we'll talk about this since it's kind of goes in line with the headlines of TikTok getting banned, is China's building projects can also be viewed as like a Trojan horse for some national security concerns and for like spyware, basically. I have some figures here that 70% of the 4G networks in Africa were developed by Huawei, which is the Chinese tech company whose phones are banned in the United States. And China has constructed or renovated nearly 200 government buildings across Africa. 40 out of the 54 African nations have government buildings constructed by China, and most likely are monitored in all ways, to the point where even the Heritage Foundation in the United States has warned U.S. diplomats in Africa, assume all of your communications in Africa are being monitored by the Chinese. So this is a serious concern where it's, again, that Trojan horse of China coming in and offering infrastructure deals. Hey, we'll put in 4G networks. Hey, we'll build railroads and highways. It also comes, and we'll build your government buildings. It also comes with the caveat of, we're also going to be listening to everything that happens inside that government building, and we own your tech infrastructure. That's a high price to pay. On top of that is the foreign investment from countries like the European nations and the United States. We're part of a group that's called the OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. There's a rule that says when you do foreign investment and when you give aid in these projects and various things like that, you can't create like an exclusivity deal that then you only have to buy American products or you only have to buy German cars or whatever. China is not a part of the OECD and does have these exclusivity deals. So in Ethiopia, part of the deal was, all of your resources for your shoe industry you have to get from China. You have to have that. You have to sign this exclusivity deal if you want to get our foreign investment. That kind of offer is banned in the Western nations. It's considered dubious diplomacy and dubious economic politics. So that's another big worry is China's not even playing by the same rules as the IMF or nations in Europe on their level.
Yeah, I mean, a lot to unpack there. First on the tech thing and basically having back doors open for Chinese intelligence and surveillance. I mean, yeah, in my opinion, I think that is problem number one. And obviously, for different countries, there's going to be different incentives and different like hierarchies of problems here. But I think in the end of the day, that is the blowback we're seeing, because I have so many friends I talk to on a daily basis who are like, I think the U.S. is really suffering and China, like they should be afraid of China. And, a year ago, I would agree with that statement. But I really think that with COVID and with these TikTok problems, the skirmishes with India, the Uyghur issue, I think there's a global blowback on China. And we're seeing, I think, some limitations to Chinese power, because that's the problem is I don't think anyone trusts China. I don't think anyone's really going, they have our back. They're here because they actually want to see us grow, and that's always been a problem I have is that, the U.S., as flawed as we may be at times, we have a soft propaganda, soft power that is really unbeatable between culture, Hollywood, music, food, just that whole periphery power that we have. And China doesn't really have that. Like, China's basically kind of globally talked about as people who don't really have a value, but they care about spending money for influence. They reverse engineer technology. They're locking up Muslims. And they basically have created apps just to get backdoors into your phone. It's really not a good PR game. And I think even Africa is starting to see kind of a blowback to Chinese policy. And now the second part of it is to me kind of ironic, because we did our episode months ago now on the World Health Organization, right, and how there's criticism that they've kind of got swayed in the Chinese direction. Well, the same thing's happening with the World Bank. I mean, the World Bank is one of the ones who has pushed for all these debt-riddled African countries to accept these projects, from the first growth and transformation plan in China, which is I think 2009. And then the second one, which is in 2015, the World Bank's been pushing all these, calling it the Chinese model. And I think that's the problem, is that the United States, even though our soft power, I would argue, is still stronger than China, China's kind of embedded themselves in all these multinational organizations like the World Health Organization, the World Bank, the IMF. And that's why you see the World Bank kind of lulling these illusions of an African continent. And there's some serious problems there, because, I mean, like you talked about with these shoe issues, I mean, there's also the problem where a lot of people thought this infrastructure spending was going to bring jobs to Africa. It's not. They're importing Chinese jobs. There's a lot of Chinese people coming in to take these jobs. Like, this is totally exactly what the West was doing in the 70s and 80s, but China's doing it. And instead of neoliberalism, it's more of a Keynesian style, the multiplier theory, which says that any increase in aggregate demand would result in more than proportional increases in GDP. And that only works, though, if every facet of every country is being used and you're still not getting influence from outside of Africa. And that's what worries me here, is that I think that Africa is going to have some serious issues. And I don't know. I really think we're kind of doing the 70s and 80s all over again, because, again, Africa's not unified. And again, there's an outside influence that is taking advantage of kind of a disintegrated African continent.
Yeah, I mean, well, we do have to give credit where credit's due, right? There are nations in Africa that have seen an immense growth. Like Ethiopia, for example, it's one of the fastest growing economies on the planet, period. Growing economies, not largest economy already, but one of the fastest growing economies. Has 6% GDP growth the last few years, which is really good. I mean, most people consider 3% GDP growth as an average good basis of good progress. But it just got downgraded. So the World Bank has said that they thought it was going to be 8% next year, and now it's got downgraded to like low sixes. And their growth started before the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. You know, their GDP growth really started in the early 2000s in Ethiopia. But what has changed is these infrastructure projects we've talked about, right? These Keynesian multiplier theory based infrastructure projects, building railroads, to Djibouti across the country, hard infrastructure projects that, like you said, only provide productivity if they're being used. The issue here is the one in Ethiopia might not be being used to its full potential and might be completely circumvented by other roads to other cities that are just better to go to Djibouti. And then the big problem is what we're talking about, right? Is what's the cost? I have a figure here that even though Ethiopia's GDP has been growing extremely well based on world standards, its debt has risen from 35% of their GDP in 2007, which is already pretty high, to 60% of their GDP in 2018. And that is not good when your debt is that high of your GDP, especially when your GDP is still relatively small on the world stage. And that's the issue we're seeing here. Like you said, is, you could have this short-term maybe boost of foreign investment, but if you're having a debt-riddled country, it can have long-term problems, even to the point where in 2017, Ethiopia had to purposely devalue their currency to kind of stifle this debt issue. And again, like I said, 90% of their imports around footwear are from China now because of that exclusivity deal. You really wonder what is the long-term cost, especially since if you look at the history of their GDP growth in Ethiopia, it did start before the whole Belt and Road Initiative. It's almost like if only a better actor could have come in and taken the place of China, maybe you wouldn't have all these issues. But I think Ethiopia, especially now with coronavirus shutting down economies, or at least slowing the rate of growth in basically the world economy, I think the cracks in this ship are now going to be exacerbated by the pandemic, and we'll have to see where Ethiopia lies in 21. I mean, that what I just talked about, how the World Bank kind of downgraded their projected growth by 2%. This was earlier in the year, and now with the pandemic, who knows where Ethiopia will be in 21 or 22. So so I mean, again, I think the main theme is you get foreign investment, but at what cost? I mean, a mass amount of debt, and then how do you handle debt? You're either going to have to raise taxes, or limit public spending, or both, and both, especially if you do both of those things, that can be really detrimental to economic growth.
Right. And what you were saying about how Ethiopia was already seeing at least minor growth before the Belt and Road Initiative is kind of a case to the contrary point I would use against the Belt and Road Initiative, which is, this is from the Atlantic Council, but they did a survey on Nigeria, which, for maybe listeners who don't know, I mean, Lagos, Nigeria is probably going to be either the first, second, or third biggest city in the world by 2050. And Nigeria in general has some of the biggest oil reserves in the world. So this is a country that, without the Belt and Road Initiative, was already doing significantly well. But now my issue is that the Atlantic Council says that there's going to be a huge economic contraction following this outbreak. And they see Nigeria's GDP declining something like 2.5% or even 4% at the most in 2020 alone. And they could lose up to 20 billion in their GDP, which would be more than 2/3 of their direct impact coming from oil prices. And so, okay, this is a country that's successful without Chinese money, but what are they going to do when they have a pandemic, an economic contraction, and need for help when a lot of the West are turning inward?
Right.
And so I read a very pro Belt and Road Initiative article, so definitely take it with a grain of salt. It's from Baker McKenzie, and it's called The Impact of COVID-19 on China's BRI, China's Belt and Road Initiatives in Africa. And it's by someone who's very pro the Silk Road. And so what he does is he talks about how China actually could bring positive benefits. And I mean, let's be honest, no one else right now is willing to really help Africa except for the IMF and the World Bank. But I mean, it's pretty clear why they want to, but this article says that healthcare is going to be crucial, right? Like after this pandemic, like the Chinese are going to be able to bring significantly good technology. Um, they're going to be able to bring stuff that can actually help mix the public and private in Africa's just failing healthcare sectors. And so there's going to be a demand for help in any way. And I think China's going to fill that in the form of healthcare and transportation and infrastructure still. And so it's really tough to me, man. Like, because the problem is that I full-heartedly disagree with what China is doing, but this is going to be a continent that's going to need a lot of help after it. And but the one thing I'll say, and this is kind of my theory, and I'm curious to kind of get your feedback, is that what I would argue is that Africa needs to unify more than they are currently, because right now they have the African Monetary Union, which was formed in Nigeria, and they have, I would say, a quasi uniform monetary system, because right now I know that there's in the West the African CFA franc and Central African CFA franc, and then there's the South African rand, which is also considered somewhat of a quasi like international currency. But I feel like Africa needs to work towards even more unification, because they could set forth a common goal and policy driven plan, I think, that would express their concerns with China. I feel like right now the problem is that because Africa is so divided and fragilized, that the Chinese have been able to kind of take advantage of these infrastructure plans because there's no common goal on the African side.
Yeah.
And it's easier said than done, but I think that's where it needs to come. Like, you know, like I mean, we saw the same thing in the 70s, like we've been talking about. Like, it doesn't really matter if it's the Americans or the Chinese. They both have the same incentive, which is debt and infrastructure projects and compliance. And I think until Africa can kind of unify and understand what they want to do as a continent, because let's be honest, there's different countries, different cultures, different languages, but at the end of the day, they're going to need to be a unified continent if they want to face these issues.
Yeah, I mean something like a European Union, but in Africa, right, where you still have sovereign nations, but they do come together and make continent-wide decisions. I do think that would be amazing. That'd be great. I think there's a long road to get there. I think that you know, I mean, it's more possible now maybe than ever, but still, I think there's such deep-rooted ethnic conflict that's rampant across Africa, even within. I mean, if you I've watched some documentaries about Uganda and the CAR, and how many paramilitary groups on paramilitary groups and ethnic conflicts go on in remote regions. It's like you can't even keep track of how many different ethno conflicts are going on in Africa. You don't see that in Europe, right? You certainly used to, but you don't see that in Europe today on the same scale. You know, those kind of paramilitary group conflicts are going to have to calm down before you really have truly powerful sovereign states be able to unify without the fear of, fracturing on its own like house of cards. But you do see, like you said, you do see movements trying to do this. I pulled up here some information about the East African Federation, which is the idea of a one single federated sovereign state, which would combine Burundi, Kenya, Rwanda, South Sudan, Tanzania, and Uganda, which is a huge block of Eastern African countries. So in 2018, the committee was formed to draft this constitution. They want to have the constitution fully written by at the end of 2021, and then they'd like to have it signed and enacted by 2023. But the problem is we've seen this attempted before in the 60s, and it didn't pan out. And so, I'm hopeful. I want it to happen, but who knows if this progress has been stifled by the pandemic, or if it's made it, maybe perhaps go quicker. But I definitely agree with you. I think that especially the larger nations like Ethiopia or Nigeria, South Africa. Well, I mean, South Africa is kind of on its own thing, but certainly the larger nations in Africa, the more that they can, coalesce and unify and have sort of a, like you said, like an idea of their own vision of Africa, the better. I mean, I don't want to see anyone fractured. I don't want to see ethnic conflict. And I'd like to see Africa be elevated to on the world stage to not have to take massive debt from Western or East Asian countries. I want them to be on the same level as everyone else. But I do think that it's a long, difficult road to get there. I really don't see that happening anytime soon, unfortunately.
Right, right. And, unfortunately, pre-COVID at least, I've been really fascinated with reading up on kind of where Africa's going, and I guess that's why I got this part-time job. Now working with the African Center for Strategic Studies, who are kind of working on these exact things, which is, you know, looking into how like alternatives to African democracy, alternatives to economic structures in Africa, and I think that's where the next step is going to come, because if you notice, the COVID death rate is very low in Africa compared to a lot of more developed countries. And I think it's because the population's younger. There's a lot of young people who have grown up with better technology and with discourse. And so I think there's something being said. There is the road being paved, but unfortunately, I think this pandemic mixed with Chinese influence is going to make it a lot worse. And I mean, we're seeing China's already kind of making this issue worse in Africa, I would argue, because I found an interesting piece that was looking at why there's certain countries who are not in the Belt and Road Initiative in Africa. And there's actually, I believe, 14. And to name a few, it's like Eritrea, Mauritius, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the Central African Republic, Benin, Equatorial Guinea, Swaziland, which is now Eswatini, Botswana. And the article talks about how, for example, Swaziland, which is now Eswatini, that they haven't been allowed to sign on to the BRI with China because they recognize Taiwan. So China's automatically said, haha, sorry, you guys aren't welcome. And then both Sao Tome and Principe and Burkina Faso also kind of just joined after severing relations with Taipei. So they were kind of forced to turn their back on Taiwan. And then the other 7 of the 14 nations who are not in there opposed China's ascension to the United Nations in 1971. So the only countries who have not joined have opposed some form of Chinese influence. And so I'm seeing China starting to almost divide up this nation in terms of at least economic strength and infrastructure strength. And that's going to even create inside of Africa haves versus have-nots. And I mean, honestly, man, I just think maybe the reason why we still have these internal conflicts and ethnic conflicts is because of external influence. And I don't really care if it's America and the Washington Consensus, or if it's the Chinese. We don't take the time to understand Africa. And I think they need to diversify and maybe be left alone. And that's kind of not a popular opinion, but I don't think us just throwing money at them is really the solution.
Well, no, certainly not. Certainly not that, because that's been done for years and it doesn't work. I mean, it's often ends up in the hands of warlords, but or at least it has in the past. But I do think that the problem is with what you said, right? Because obviously, an Africa that's united and has its own agency is ideal. But if we were to just have completely hands off, which is somewhat kind of what the U.S. is currently doing, then China just swoops in, whether we like it or not, right? And so, I mean, 14 have rejected the Belt and Road Initiative, but 40 something are on board. And you said it yourself, right? It's political who is involved in the Belt and Road Initiative, and it's having that political power over those nations. Hey, you can't recognize these nations at all. You're not going to say anything about the Uyghur Muslims, even though if you're a Northern African nation, you're probably majority Muslim. You can't say anything about that. And the problem is China does have this influence and is gaining an influence. Now, yes, we've seen that it's not all roses, because a lot of these infrastructure projects might not come to full fruition like they had initially planned, but they're certainly providing benefits. You mentioned in that article as well as the healthcare system. There is a reason people are signing on to these, because they say, look, maybe we give up some national security with the privacy with Huawei. Maybe we give up some of our votes in the UN to whatever China wants. But we are getting something in return, which is foreign investment, a boost in GDP, healthcare infrastructure. So it's going to be hard. It's like you said, like, people should leave Africa alone, but Africa is still signing these deals. These various nations are still, they're playing a part in signing on to the Belt and Road Initiative. And I just don't think that leaving a vacuum just means that China is just going to exert the most influence in the region. I think it would take unfortunately, the history of U.S. and European influence in Africa is not great. So I see why there's so much skepticism. But I feel like it's going to have to take outside influence to try and push China away and promote, functioning and sovereign democracies. But gosh, what a big ask.
Yeah, I mean, like when I say leaving it alone, I mean, I just think that more is just a very pragmatic look. Like, obviously, when you're in the moment, it's really hard to isolate the moment from what you need at the moment. And I think that's where Africa's at, and that's where they've been at, unfortunately, for decades, is that, if someone's throwing around money, you're not really going to look at how much you're going to have to pay back in the next, 50 years. And I think it more comes down to the fact that I do believe that this pandemic and the last, maybe 3 or 4 months have not been good for China.
No, they
And
haven't.
And I really do think that if the U.S. could get back to better leadership on a global scale, I think we could win in this kind of soft power messaging game, because we're not perfect, but we're damn better than China, I will say, when it comes to our worldview and what we want to do. And I just feel like Africa actually was on a pretty good trajectory a year ago.
Yeah.
When it came to at least establishing somewhat of a framework for where they want to go next. And I'm worried now that China's going to give them an easy buyout, between healthcare and infrastructure and just, short time bonds potentially, like I was talking about last week with the EU stuff. And yeah, I mean, it's really worrying to me, because I really think that the African continent in general has been long neglected.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot we could really get out of it. I think there's always been a kind of half focus on South America, but there's never been a focus on Africa other than resources and colonialism. And I bet there are some ideas out there in Africa that will never be acknowledged just because no one's listening. So
Well said. I mean, unfortunately, I think you're right there. I think that should wrap up this episode. What do you feel? You think I mean, obviously, we barely scratched the surface, right? But we could dedicate a whole other podcast to just Africa and the modern world. But certainly a super interesting topic. And again, I think the pandemic does put a lot of weird kinks in the armor of the Belt and Road Initiative, and we'll have to see how it plays out in the next few years. Thanks everyone for tuning in on our Twitch. I saw a couple people tuned in to say hi and listen, and we appreciate that. And if you missed the live stream on Twitch, you can definitely get the video upload on YouTube at the Tonic Accord YouTube channel, as well as the audio on Podbean, Apple Podcasts, a flurry of other third-party sites. And we'd love to have you tune in. Thanks for listening.
take care, guys.